You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendent and Leadership Podcast, a proud member of the Podcasserole Network. Hey, Jamie.
Hey, Peter. How are you?
I sometimes say that before Jimmy gets on. This time he's on and was mouthing it as I was doing it, and then was kind of doing a monster truck like, it'll be awesome.
It'll be awesome. It'll be awesome. My youngest, my 8-year-old, is now learned to do the intros. And he says things like, Bigfoot, 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 the biggest foot.
Oh my God. If you could record him, I'd love to just add that. We should just add that at the end of our podcast. Just like when David Letterman had some weird thing that goes across the screen. That's my pants. This would be great. Bigfoot, Bigfoot, Bigfoot.
It's got a Bigfoot. Yeah. It's like he's stomping out the competition. That's what
Oh, that is amazing. It's amazing. This is an encore episode. And let me just say that this was from season 1. It was second to last of season 1. It was the first one, I think, of season 1. And Max Silverman is our guest. He was the executive director at CEL, the Center for Educational Leadership at the University of Washington. He still serves in capacity there as an advisor and a guide and has a role there. You're going to hear me talk about the fact that he's the executive director, but he has passed that on and is still a presence there and is supporting them in sort of a emeritus role. And he's doing work with you, isn't he?
Yeah, we are partnered with Max almost as it feels like to be
and when
our
you say
teacher,
we, sorry,
my
APC.
Right? APC, yeah, APC Leadership Collaborative. So my team and I are learning from Max. It's so fun. As folks will hear in this interview, he is the most humble leader in a way in which when he offers books, oh, have you read this book? And you're like, no, I've never heard of that book. And he's like, yeah, it was written by, and
he does that in the interview too. In the
yes, he does.
He does. Do you know this book? I'm like, and then when I'm like, do you know this book? He's like, yeah, of course I do. Everybody knows that book. Like,
exactly.
I know, but he doesn't. But he is humble. So I will let me back up and say he doesn't actually act that way. He's like, yeah, oh, I know that one.
So I always think when I think about our work in terms of supporting schools and districts to have improved their instruction for every kid, I had a set of questions. I think they're great. They're good. They're great. I share them with Max. He's like, oh, that's amazing. That's such a good question. Have you ever thought about asking also? And then whatever he asks also, I'm like, oh, that's a better question.
I was like, you know what? I want people to listen for because he talks about when you're asking, when the work, what he said, like when you ask simple questions, you get complex responses or something like that. You ask complex questions, you get simple responses. And I am right now in Cartagena, Colombia. I'm about to have our beginning of the year meetings with teachers, and it couldn't have come at a better time to be reminded. Hey, Peter, when you ask a comprehensive question that goes like this, you can probably expect that you're going to get a pretty simple answer. Keep it simple. Be really thoughtful about where they've been, where they are, and where they're going kind of stuff, but make it simple and not contrite. Just don't overthink it and then watch what will unfold. I'm really excited about that.
I fully agree. Having just led our first workshop with a leadership team on instruction with Max's advising put in, I could see where we got too complicated, where my own questions got too complicated. I'm more excited about what Max has taught me, and I'm dying to just share all of these questions. And honestly, it's too much. That's too much. The question is, what do you think? Like, yeah.
Yes.
And then shut up.
And then shut up. And then right. And then follow the rules that you have told me from day one, right? Zaroli?
Ciroli, yeah. Ernesto
yeah.
Ciroli, yeah.
Ernesto Ciroli. Yeah.
Good discussions. Anyway, so Max is great. I'm listening to him in this interview when people are about to, and this is now how many years ago? What year was this?
This
23. Replay?
Yeah.
23, so 3 years ago.
But it's as relevant today as it was then. And my audience was so much smaller than our audiences now.
Yeah. I love it. I love that they're going to get to hear him. I love that I feel so lucky that I know him and I get to partner with him, and yeah.
Okay.
And I get to stay we stayed in his house. I stayed in his house. So I think I like the guy.
Oh man. Yes, you did. So our sponsor is IXL. And you know what? Great leadership is about knowing exactly where your students are and where they need to go. And that is why they are a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. If you want to provide real-time analytics, you want to provide a personalized curriculum, you want to turn data into action, if you're working to close those equity gaps, or you just want to support teachers or do both, IXL gives you your district and gives you those tools to lead with clarity. So head on over to ixl.com/imperfect to start your journey today. And now we'll start our journey with Max Silverman. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Manson. Can't wait to hear this one.
Today on An Imperfect Leader, Max Silverman is my guest. And Max is the Executive Director of the University of Washington Center for Educational Leadership, CEL, where he provides leadership for improving school systems focused on equitable outcomes for students. Throughout his career, Max has served in a variety of leadership positions, including classroom teacher, school principal, district leader, and most recently as Deputy Director of CEL, and now the Director of CEL. And so he's known and respected locally and nationally, and I'm thrilled to have him as a guest. Max, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thanks, Peter. I'm really excited to be here with you.
So, Max, for those who are not familiar with the Center for Educational Leadership, I know I can say that you lead national projects to implement new systems to improve leadership effectiveness. And that happens with individual school districts who want to improve leadership performance at scale. And you do this at the school level with supporting the growth of principals, and with their teacher leader groups, their teams. And then you do this at the district level, supporting superintendents and their teams. And as I've gotten to become more familiar with the way that CEL supports schools and school districts, I've learned a great deal about the different frameworks that you use to support leadership. And I wonder, would you tell us just about those frameworks and an example of how you use them to fuel continuous development?
Yeah, Peter, I have to say, I really appreciate since we first met how you've just tuned into and attuned to what we're trying to do with our frameworks, because I think there's a real power to them. And I just appreciate how you've dug into them. We've learned that what we call frameworks are really great tools for leaders to both individually and system-wide reflect and learn. And our frameworks were designed with some guiding principles. And the first thing that we thought of was something that I heard from Bob Lenz from the Buck Institute, who taught me that simple tools lead to complex thinking and complex tools lead to simple thinking. And so I hope you noticed in our framework, they're simple, but not simplistic. And they're also designed to both create aspirational views, as well as use inquiry questions to make either individuals or a whole system really reflect on where they're at in relation to what practice can be.
Yeah, so for those who are listening, and I will put a link to CEL's website because you offer those frameworks for leaders and the public for their perusal. And what I really have always appreciated about them as I've gotten to read them more thoroughly is exactly that. They are reflective questions that allow for that collective aspiration to guide how we want to be together as an organization, as well as how I want to be individually as a leader. And you're right, they aren't complicated questions, but they really do get to the heart of what one might be trying to achieve for their district, a different way of leading.
Yes. And there was more to your question that I think I didn't get to.
So tell us more about the frameworks. And my apologies for interrupting, but you have two different frameworks, one for principals, one for leaders, although they're very complementary, but they do speak to the different roles that individuals play within their organization.
Yeah, it's funny. We actually now are up to 4 frameworks, and it starts with our teaching and learning framework, which we call the 5 dimensions of teaching and learning. We also have one for school leadership. We also designed one to help school leaders understand how to lead for teacher learning. And then the 4th one, the central office one, around supporting principals as leaders for equity. And that's when people will see us, they grab them. They're really centered in practice. So it helps somebody think about what it is they're doing day in and day out in their work. And it's been kind of fun. If you want, I could tell you maybe like a quick story of one of the frameworks.
I would love it.
Yeah. So I work a lot with our principal support framework. And it basically, to some degree, answers the question, what do central office leaders do if they're really supporting principals as leaders of equity for their school? Very different than when it first was written to how do you help principals be instructional leaders. We have a much broader take, and it's designed around a few central things that we learned from talking with principals and system leaders. So one, we learned school systems have minimal clarity on the role of principals. If we say, what's the principal's job? They might give us like a framework, or their evaluation tool. But when we ask
Right. Or the job description, which is just a laundry list of tasks with the
Totally.
last bullet saying, and other duties as assigned.
we have this it's a pretty funny survey that we do of central office managers. And the first question is, what's the role of principal in your system? And the options are instructional leader, building manager, CEO, or based on what they're good at. Only 2 school systems that we've done this with have got an over 50% agreement. And what that means for a principal then is, for the business manager, oh, I'm a CEO. For the facilities folks, I'm a building manager. For the teaching and learning folks, I'm an instructional leader. And so everybody treats me as this different role. So the framework helps with that. But we also learned that school systems don't have any systems of professional learning for principals. They might, if they're lucky, have a good supervisor who's a good coach. They might, if they're lucky, bring in a good PD provider every now and then. But there's no thoughtful way around our principals or our key leaders. How do we help them develop and grow? What does their work look like individually? How do they learn together? What are our systems of learning? So it addresses that, but it also addresses this idea that principals most typically experience the rest of the central office as reactive and top-down. They are an implementer of 10 or 15 different people's wonderful initiatives.
Yes, and often impulsive implementers, right? They see a one sort of episodic issue, and then they generalize everyone must be struggling with this, and then impulsively assign a new initiative, right?
Definitely. Yes, I know in school systems, they think they're being smart when each department just has one initiative, but at that bottom of that funnel is the principal, who is still grappling with 8 to 12 initiatives. And our latest version, Peter, and I think you'll appreciate this, is really cool, is we also learned from principals that they're being asked to lead for equity. That's the new mandate on them. And most of them want to do that, but they don't work in school systems where the central office models what inclusive and equity-centered leadership looks like day to day in practice. Those are our four dimensions, right? Like inclusive and equity-centered leadership at the central office, role clarity for the principal, systems of professional learning, and a school district central office that's proactive in supporting schools and principals. And when it's in play, we haven't gotten anybody to get all the way through the framework yet, but we have had people really work on role clarity and do that with principals, and that's a help. And then that tees up to professional learning. And then we've had a lot of fun using design thinking to help different departments in the central office be more proactive in their approach. So it's been fun to see districts who take this on more seriously really grapple with, because of the framework, what's not in place for principals. And then the first thing they ask is, oh, who can we go see that does this well? And we say, there's nobody. You have to figure this out in your context. And then to watch them really take it on has been a lot of fun.
I think that's so important. Talk to some superintendents around the nation who have indicated those visits to other districts are important, and at the same time to recognize that your context and your situation is different. And so how do you take good learning and good practices, but also consider how it might apply in your own community? In the leadership model that I have used to advise others, there's a dimension, and we've just talked about this a little bit, collective aspiration. And that's really the heart of an organization's work. And I think that Cell really keys in on that. It speaks to Peter Senge's 2 big questions. What do we want to create together? And how do we want to be together? And inside that dimension is a term that actually comes from another educational leader, an instructional leader, Ron Berger. And I'm certain you are familiar with his work, right?
Yeah.
And his book, An Ethic of Excellence, right? Ethics, but an ethic and ethos. And when I was reading about Cell's 5 dimensions of teaching and learning, that ethic of excellence really jumped to mind. Giving children authentic experiences to learn, valuing their voice and their identities, encouraging productive struggles, setting goals, and documenting progress. I mean, these are all traits that Ron Berger writes about, and these are definitely important to Cell. And I wonder, would you just take a moment and let's just explore that a little bit? You've talked about it to some extent, and I've appreciated that. But what I mean is like the district leaders get mired in the operations of their district, right? Or in the operations of their building. They see themselves as managers, and they need to be pulled back really to that core function of their jobs to make sure that children are honored and valued and that they're learning. And I wonder, how do you and your colleagues help shift schools to prioritize that approach?
Yeah, I was a former client of Cell's when I was a new high school principal. And one of Cell's mantras back then is you can't lead what you don't know. And the one thing that's clear across the country, and we have some pretty good research to back this up, is most people charged with leading schools or districts don't have the ability to get into a classroom or school and even come up with a hypothesis around what's the teaching and what learning is that causing and for which students, or even worse, what learning isn't happening and for which students and why. And so from its start, Cell has just always believed that the only place you can really develop leadership expertise and practice is in the presence of students and their learning. So we start all of our work from Richard Elmore's instructional core. And we actually developed the framework because of that. 20 years ago, walkthroughs used to look like something like 8 to 10 leaders get in a room and decide they're going to do a walkthrough. And they say, oh, we want to look at student engagement. And then they'll say, oh, what does student engagement look like? And they'll just off the top of their head, make from their best knowledge, talk about what it looks like. And imagine like rounds at a hospital. I know Dick Elmore uses that example too. If doctors didn't have an understanding together and a calibration around anatomy, them going in and looking at a patient and trying to figure out what's going on with this patient. They don't have to make stuff up, right? They actually understand human anatomy and systems and have a way of thinking. So we built the framework to help leaders see, so that when they are in classrooms together to develop hypotheses around what's causing learning or not, they now have an anatomy of instruction. And so, so all of our learning with leaders, everything we try to do, then we do in classrooms, so that if they're trying to fix a system, it starts with what problems of student learning are you actually trying to solve? And oftentimes, I'll just share real quick, we see superintendents often. I have a great example from the Yakima Valley School District, 3rd grade, math scores were low for their English language learning student. And these were middle school students, pardon me. And the superintendent immediately wanted to figure out what's on the marketplace that I can buy that's targeted at English language learners and men.
Can I take a guess on what the situation was?
Yes.
I'm going to guess that during math instruction, children's English learning time was at the same time. And so children were being pulled out of their math instruction to go do isolated English instruction. Am I anywhere close?
No.
No, because you see that all the time. Children don't seem to be progressing in mathematics. What's happening during math time? Oh, they're in English class. Oh,
that does happen. But so what we decided was, let's go see these kids in class. And what we noticed pretty quickly was their computational skills were really good. They could actually do the math, but their ability to write responses is where they were really struggling. And then we talked about, so what's going on here? And it ended up that the district had invested heavily. This was back in the day in SIOP. And so really they had made investments in teacher being able to use English language targets and meet the needs of English language learners in the content. And yet we saw none of that. So we just, before you spend a couple $100,000 and plugging kids on a computer, what are some things that might be causing, because they can do the math, so they don't need to be on a remedial program.
Gotcha. So while many districts will take a purely quantitative look at student achievement and then make decisions or impressions or interpret that data in one way, it appears that what you're also suggesting is do not discount the qualitative piece of being in a classroom, observing what's happening, and from the metaphor that you used in terms of going through doing hospital rounds, like having a clear and consistent shared image of what success looks like. And then are we seeing that within this space?
You nailed it. So that's what we're trying to do with school systems at scale is, can you have a calibrated vision of high quality instruction for your district? And then can you develop, we have these, we could go on forever. We teach alongside this, what we call the habits of thinking for instructional leadership. And that is, everybody talks about noticing and wondering, but we're real clear, like noticing is gathering objective qualitative data. Draw a picture of the classroom, write down, script the questions, who's answering questions, all those things. Then we teach folks how to wonder. And wonder for us is, can you actually be curious about what's happening, what about the teacher moves, about student responses? And then we teach them from that how to develop some trends. What did we see? And then we do something really cool. We teach the habit of hypothesizing, because most leaders, if we can slow them down to notice, wonder, and develop trends, they're done. They're jumping right to conclusion and next steps. So the hypothesis is what's really cool, because that's where we get them to just think about all the things that might be causing these trends. And then from there, to think about what are the implications for teacher learning and what are the implications for your leadership.
I love it. Yeah. As you were describing, looking at trends and pieces like that, one piece as they're developing their own hypotheses about why these things are happening, I imagine because of Cell's interest in equity, that the conversation around mindsets comes into play, right? In terms of,
definitely.
Okay, so we notice who's being called, who's not being called, where children are sitting, the movement of teachers, the spotlighting of behaviors, all those types of things, and then getting to that sort of bottom piece. Why do we think that might be happening?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because, as you know from all of your work, when students are engaged, the first thing somebody wants to do is buy more professional development. And it might be there are other issues around implicit bias and expectation that no matter what training you provide on how to ask better questions, teachers still might believe that certain students can't answer those questions, which means you need a different treatment in that setting.
Yes, we could have a whole conversation about AP classes and honors classes.
So two things, the calibration and then alongside habits of thinking really allow leaders to then take that qualitative data and make better choices around actions they want to take to change the equation around who's learning in their classrooms.
Max, I'd like to ask you the question that I ask every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Really well. When we were both in San Antonio for the AASA National Conference, and when I was looking through the brochure before I met you, I actually saw the session that you were doing. And as I immediately saw that, I'm like, that's a session for me. And it just struck me. I don't know if you coined the phrase or not, but it really speaks to who I am as a leader. And I'm sure lots of my colleagues can attest to that. And this idea that if we can just embrace our own imperfection and the fact that we're never quite there, we're more likely to make more progress towards wherever it is we're leading and how we're trying to grow. So it really resonates.
And I imagine because of the national presence that Cell has, being able to bring that approach to the leaders that you're coaching certainly elevates their ability and their willingness to be vulnerable in a space where, and in an industry where vulnerability hasn't always been prioritized or valued.
Yeah, we see that, again, our frameworks are designed to make you vulnerable because there's no right answer. And if we can get leaders, I've mentioned to you, I lead a superintendent's network out of the Yakima Valley, and the setup is always around a consultancy protocol. And to get a superintendent, it's so easy for them to talk about what teachers aren't doing right, or maybe what principals need to do differently, and to keep
and their boards.
Yes, and to keep asking questions to get them to their own practice, and then to share a problem of their practice. It's actually a problem of their practice, not somebody else's. It's a little bit tricky.
So I want to talk a minute about the Mosaic Project. It is one of our favorite organizations and has over 25 years of experience empowering students to really celebrate differences, communicate assertively, and resolve conflict peacefully at their outdoor school. I happen to have experience being part of the Mosaic Project, and so I can absolutely tell you it's an amazing organization. Their innovative SEL curriculum is now available to our Imperfect Leader audience. And so you can get a 10% discount through their new documentary film-based Mosaic Classroom Project. So just let the people know during your onboarding process to receive that 10% discount is to just mention An Imperfect Leader.
Learn more about the Mosaic Project at mosaicproject.org.
When leaders think in systems, they think differently. They see the big picture, making decisions that create coherence and strengthen communication across their teams. They build adaptability, flexibility, and engagement. Every day, school leaders face complex challenges, from student engagement to staff alignment. What if your team could see those challenges as part of a bigger picture? That's what happens when you think in systems. It's how leaders turn complexity into connection and challenges into opportunities for growth. At the Waters Center for Systems Thinking, we help educators and organizations build this capacity, developing the habits and tools that turn vision into action. Think differently, think in systems. Sign up for our webinars, free resources, or a consultation by visiting our website, which you can find in the show notes.
We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Max Silverman, and Max is the executive director of the University of Washington's Center for Educational Leadership, also known as CEL. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. So, Max, what happened?
Yeah, I was a high school principal, and I was leading a conversion of a comprehensive high school to 3 small schools. And at the time we were doing this, there was a lot of, the Gates Foundation was investing heavily in small schools, and small schools was the rage across the country. And pretty quickly, people were seeing that new startup small schools had advantages. So the pilot schools in Boston and the small schools in New York City had certain advantages in that they were able to create the cultures that they wanted for their students and school community. The opposite was happening on what they call conversion campuses. That's sort of the status quo, the culture of the comprehensive high school in all sorts of ways, whether it was the sports programs, the music programs, the math department wanting to stay together across small schools as a math department, really was getting in the way of these schools getting off the ground. And so we were far enough out in terms of there was enough evidence and examples of these conversions and what was causing them not to work, that we really understood that small school autonomy was critical to success. And then there's a number of decisions that have to be made to create this autonomy. I won't get into all of those decisions, but the one that I would like to share with you was a decision that, as the outgoing principal, I still had some say over what was going to happen in the autonomous schools. And one thing we learned was the old principal has to go, because that person was one of the people that sort of kept the old culture going.
They represent status quo. Got it.
Yes. So on the way out, I wanted to use my position to help the new principals get some things in place. And one thing we all deeply believed, and I might have been the most adamant, was that to foster autonomy, schools should be able to set their own schedules. And that's the decision that I made that really I still think about many years later.
So we're going to get into that a little bit here. One of the pieces that, for those who are listening, a conversion into 3 is meaning that you have a large comprehensive high school and you're going to break it into 3 distinct schools within that same building. So students will be assigned to one of 3 buildings. And I'm familiar with it from my time in Oakland, California. We saw that happening at Oakland Tech, at Fremont. So we saw school within a school kind of model. Castlemont is a good example.
Yeah, we studied Oakland very closely.
Yeah, I'm sure there were a lot of lessons learned. Those in my doctoral program who were doing it and leading in that were lamenting, or what seemed to be celebratory initially was, wow, there's a lot going on here. So
there were some really brilliant people trying to figure out how to do right by kids. And
that's exactly right. Yeah. So as you're looking back, what got overlooked?
What worked was that, along with some other moves, it really did allow these small schools to quickly build cultures. What was overlooked was this was, to begin with, a smaller comprehensive high school, maybe about 1,200 students. So now you're talking about small schools of about 300 students. And what got overlooked was getting students access to both upper level classes, so like AP classes, that the small schools couldn't afford to offer on their own. Getting them access to, there was an really beautiful regional occupational skills center that ran on a certain schedule. So getting students access to that, and also getting access to arts and music.
So when you talk about career and technical education, you're talking about AP courses, you're talking about all these electives, parts that really can act as the reason why children come to school. They're not necessarily coming to school for some of the regular academic, but rather the going deeper and following their interests. And so now you weren't able to create that. Wow. The next question is typically about what did you learn about relationships and what new relationships were formed. And I'm wondering how that all fits into how things were overlooked, because now children were somewhat limited in what they were able to do when the reason for creating the school within a school model or the conversion was to be more personalized. And now you were eliminating that option.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what happened initially was some real fracturing of relationships. And I have to say, these schools got off the ground really powerfully. And the bet was that the relationships and personalization is that's the thing that kids yearn for and would drive. And in many ways, that proved successful. And some of the small schools figured out solutions. One of them just offered AP Lit to all students in the school. And so some things were figured out, but relationships were fractured in many ways, both because some people's vested interests in different programming, they were either offended, insulted, or lost access to students who drove resources. And others, people really strongly felt that access to these programs were really critical and saw the decision that I made and supported as really disconnecting kids from important things. So I think the first thing that happened was some fracturing, and then actually a little bit of a bunker mentality. Oh, these people don't understand what we're trying to do. And they became obstacles.
Ooh, those unintended, or what do we call them? Accidental adversaries, right? Everybody's working towards a common purpose, but then become adversaries because there's this sort of causal loop within that work.
Yeah.
What frustrated you?
I think we were on our learning edge. And I think what was frustrating was, I mentioned before we started recording, this idea of that I learned from a mentor of mine, Rick Lear, who tells me he didn't get it's not from him. I don't know who he got it from. This idea of going far enough, fast enough to break the gravitational pull of the status quo. And I think what was frustrating was still doing that in a school system that, for good reason, felt a lot of responsibility to ensure that certain things were happening. Pressures around maintaining school sports that I think the school board and superintendent legitimately felt were important. So I think what was frustrating was like going to the East Coast and seeing these truly autonomous schools and not knowing how to really fully create that autonomy within the funding structure and district structure in place.
My mentor uses the phrase, when you agitate for change, the system will work aggressively to return to stasis. And so I like complementing that phrase with what you have suggested in terms of how to break through that gravitational pull. And yet you didn't totally have the autonomy to choose where you were going. You were being pulled into an orbit that you had no control over. And so that's kind of an interesting autonomy, but not autonomy to some extent. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to get the name of the book wrong, but it's Orbiting the Giant Hairball, I think. Are you familiar with that book?
No. And if that's the title, that's a wild one.
It's a wonderful book, and I won't be able to find the author right now, but it's by a guy who worked at Hallmark Cards and figured out, and for him, the hairball was the sort of bureaucracy of Hallmark Cards that was really harming Hallmark Cards because it wasn't allowing for the creativity needed to design new card brands and things like that. But he figured out a way to stay in the outside the hairball, but in the orbit, and ended up in roles that allowed him really to add value, like design new cards. He still understood what Hallmark was trying to do and what their boundaries were. So he was able to design some new greeting card lines for them that still was close enough to the Hallmark branding, but brought in new markets to them. But I love that idea. And that's what I struggled to do. That's what was frustrating.
I was going to ask,
how to stay in that orbit around the giant hairball.
Yeah, that's interesting. The last question before I ask, and in the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience is one that I sometimes don't ask leaders, but I'm going to ask you because I think it's important, because it's what got overlooked is certainly important from the system level, what frustrated you individually, and then certainly individually as well. If you could look back, what could you have done differently? Is there, as you have now, obviously this is something that's been on your mind for 20 years, and it's a great lesson for any leader who's thinking about change, particularly those who are working to change within a system that has some other established, that cultural field that is serving as that orbit.
Yeah. But part of my understanding of imperfection is not really going back and delving too much into what I could have done differently, because and I think that's important for leaders to really realize.
You get mired in your, and then you become somewhat paralyzed about making and attempting other changes down the road. Sure.
Yeah. So I think one thing when I look back on this episode of leadership, the thing I've learned the most from it is I did way too much internalizing. I came to a solution and I internalized it, as imperfect leaders do, and just got into a defensive sort of protecting my point of view mode. And I missed a lot. I really missed a lot while I was doing that.
In the end, what was something that was good that came out of the situation?
I think some really beautiful things happened for teachers and students in those schools, and they figured out a lot of things. One of the schools, Odyssey, the essential school, created, I mentioned earlier, an intercession. And it was so beautiful to see, like twice a year, I don't know if it was for 2 or 3 weeks, they shut down school so that kids could get elective credit. And either the teachers and or students designed electives. And it was really beautiful to see teachers who were interested in biking, like taking kids on bike rides for 2 or 3 weeks. Teachers interested in dance, teaching dance or photography, and students getting to learn so differently and learn about their teachers and their peers so differently.
What a beautiful way of thinking about how to create what are teachers passionate about. So now they're fully in.
Yeah.
And what are children interested in learning? And for those who are maybe driving and thinking, how might I do that in my middle school, for example? Think about how advisories are defined, because they're pretty lenient about what you do in advisory. And if you were to start with what are teachers excited about, and then allowing students to sign up for an advisory course that's actually mural painting, some amazing things can happen within your own building. And also just watch how discipline improves, attendance improves, particularly if you're doing it at some ridiculous hour in the morning, at 7:30 in the morning when children are often late to school. They never miss mural painting or woodworking or the kinds of things that typically require some type of certification, but under the umbrella of advisory can be done.
Yeah, there were some of the most beautiful moments I observed. And again, I was out of these schools by then. They were led by 3 great leaders and wonderful teachers. Some of the most powerful moments in education I've seen were in those small schools, with the level of student agency and ownership and teacher agency and ownership.
What advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
What's so interesting to me is now that I look back, I don't know if this is advice or things I've learned. One is, and this is not my term, I get this from Ed Catmull, who wrote Creativity Inc. He was one of the founders of Pixar, to see the unseen. And in my anecdote, I didn't see the unseen, and to really seek out what might be going on that you don't know or understand. I've also really lately, my colleague Casey Land at Cell really brings forth this idea of moving at the speed of trust. And I think that comes from Stephen Covey originally, and Adrienne Maury Brown really in Emergent Strategy brings that sort of sentiment forward. But any place worth going is worth going together, and you can only go together if there's trust. And I guess this is actually our good friend Joe Davis reminded me of this the other days. You can't make other people happy, so don't try. Happiness and joy are intrinsic. And
I think Joe has also told me about not letting people live rent-free in my mind.
oh, that's great. Yeah. So I think those 3 things really are what's resonating with me right now. And I wish when I was an aspiring leader, I was better able to let my ego take a back seat and let some of these other ideas really pull my leadership forward.
Max, throughout the entire conversation, you have brought up your colleagues and learning from other leaders and your mentors, and you have absolutely modeled that it is not an individual's pursuit to support others, but rather a collective pursuit. My guest again was Max Silverman, and Max is the executive director of the University of Washington Center for Educational Leadership. And Max, this has been a real treat. CEL is playing a significant role in helping schools and school districts reflect on their pasts as they build better futures. And having you join the podcast and hearing the way that schools and district leaders can agitate for change is pretty inspiring. So thank you so much for being my guest.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. We've only had 2 extended conversations in our lifetime so far, and I really enjoyed both of them and looking forward to more.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print-inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate